Show. Bam.
This is Dan Luzadder, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Yeah, so first off, my apologies to Dan. I got the time screwed up, and so I have to own these things publicly because he thought we were meeting at 12, and we ended up meeting at 12:35, and I thought we were meeting at 2. So that's on me, and I always like to be open about these things. We all make mistakes, Dan, and not that big of a deal, but it's a big deal if you don't apologize for it. So that's on me, and I appreciate you coming on the show.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So you and I have jobs that are quite similar. Well, my old job when I was a spy, in a lot of ways, what I did was I was a reporter, and when I went to school to become a television reporter, that's sort of where I learned the trade, was like to build a network and to like, what's today's story? And you go out in town and you bring your video camera and you write something, and that's the story. And that turns out that's the same thing a spy does. And so these jobs overlap tremendously well. You also learn about psychological operations and the way we craft stories, whether they're true or not. And then when you learn to see these things, when the news is thrown back at you, you're like, oh, that's not exactly true. Or when you walk around with reporters in the battlefield, like I have, you watch someone there to get their story instead of the story. And that blew me away, where I'm like, you're embedded to hear from us. And not many people will know more about the area than I do. I don't care if I make the news at all. I'm not trying to be newsworthy. Right. But if I introduce myself and say, hey, I know a lot about the area, I've got interpreters that know even more about the area. If we could all be of service to you, if we want to do that, we want the American people to know what's going on. And they can't be bothered. And then I see the story they write, and I'm like, what are we doing?
Where did that story come from?
Yeah. Thanks for coming on the show, man. I'm excited to talk to you.
Well, excited to talk to you too. You've had a really fascinating background. I'm curious, how did you get from radio TV broadcasting to being out in the field with intelligence?
I never got to get into TV broadcasting. So I got the degree, I had the little tape and everything, but it was just very hard to break in. The economy was particularly bad. The economy also was like saying, hey, let's hire less white dudes, which, hey, he gets to do that. Right. And when you go to the smallest markets and they're like, no, thanks. And I'm like, how about I carry cables? And they're like, yeah, still, no, thanks. And I'm like, nothing, not even like volunteer. And like, nope, can't do any of that. You have to pivot to something else. And so that pivot ended up being counterintelligence work. I didn't know that they were going to be, and maybe my job is one where you could bring a lot of different skill sets to it. And the way I approached it was to get into the field and go talk to people, because that's what I'm good at.
Yeah. So that's an interesting story about reporters not paying attention to the offer of sources, because this is something I've been talking about with my book, is the lack of institutional knowledge that is contributing to reporters how you go about gathering sources, which is the most important thing you can find. I can guarantee you, if you and I were out in the field and you were offering me interpreters and sources, I'd be following right up on that. That's the way it's done.
Yeah. And it's amazing because these guys, and I got to be honest too about this. My job is very specific. The Army has a lot of things to do, so they can't always sop up all the gravy that's there. But the Army often minimizes the role that the interpreters play in understanding the greater social network. And so these guys' phones won't stop ringing. And I only could take in so much of that as well, because I'm just one dude. Right. And so if I was to stoke that fire, if I had resources to work that, imagine then what I could have. And if I could, I got to be careful with how I say this, because I'm not going to break any laws now, but I could then, if I was to send people out actively to do things and task them, then I start to run afoul of the law potentially. Right. But if I could work those networks in a way that I could purposefully get those phones to ring more and guide us better, oh my gosh, even better still, right? Because again, it's the same job in a lot of ways.
It's carrying information to people who need the information to make decisions about.
Yeah. So I would build relationships with these sheikhs and these warlords and these government leaders. And it's easy now in retrospect to look back, but it doesn't occur to you when you're there because you're focused on so many things. And then one day, like this light bulb went off, and I realized, oh my gosh, these guys all talk about me as well. And these guys know each other. Maybe they're one relationship away. Maybe they're best friends. You don't know, and you don't know how they all connect. Like in our world, on the analysis side, you have a black line. It's like these guys know each other, but you don't know how close and how for how long. Always other things. And when their phone starts ringing, I'm desperate. My ego, my mission, my drive is to keep talking, keep controlling the conversation. But when their phone starts ringing and all of these dads are calling and saying, hey, my kid's a shithead. You know what he did the other day? God damn it. Can you help me out with this? And then they hang up and it's like, bling, and I'm like, I got to do my work.
Right.
But I know because at this point I'm a seasoned, spy. I know to shut up and let my interpreter just listen and get that half of the conversation. And he's like, oh boy, Mr. Johnson, he is in deep soup. And then you just write down the notes and I can do my meeting later, right? So
well,
the value of sources.
The value of sources, it's indispensable. And I learned that lesson early on when I was a young police reporter in my hometown on the gritty little daily in the industrial town I was in. The second night on police beat, I went down to the local fire station, to the dispatcher's office where they kept reports on the fire district. And the African-American dispatcher sitting there was plugging in cables to the old switchboard and keeping in touch with the firehouses. And I told him I was from the paper, and he showed me where the reports were. And then when he got less busy, turned around and asked my name. And I told him, and he said, you're not related to Kenny Luzadder, are you? And I said, yeah, he's my dad. And he jumped up out of the chair, he came over and gave me a big hug. He said, your dad gave me a job when nobody would hire blacks in this town and taught me mechanics. And I went to business school. Now I wound up in the fire department. And from then on, anything that happened in town that I didn't hear about, Chuck would call me on the phone and make sure that I was on top of it. That's the kind of source work that makes a difference.
Yeah, you're right. And how much time did you spend doing that? And is that even possible today? Because Pete would submit that I prefer that my young guys would get off the couch, get out of the house, out of the team room, and go see people with their own hands, with their own feet, and be with them. Even if they don't want to do that, go find the people that do those things. And because, you can call someone on the phone. Yeah, you can email, and you need to do those things. It's a modern way of communicating. But I also want you out in the real world, making real world friendships.
That's exactly right. I've been working on a film documentary on a series of crimes in Speedway, Indiana in 1978. And I've been pursuing things about this case since 1986. And it's a series of crimes that are fascinating. And the film that we're doing looks into police corruption and those sorts of things. But and behind these crimes, and without the source network that I developed over years and maintained, because when people called me from prisons, from whatever, I took their calls. I listened to what they had to say. It might take up a lot of time, but keeping those networks together are really important. And so now, as we're working on this film, I'm still benefiting from contacts I made 40 years ago in the state and individuals who are still actively able to point me in one direction or another. Those things have been lost in newspaper reporting. My background, they've been lost in TV too, if they were ever fully developed. The idea of being able to have personal interaction, to get to know each other, trust each other, to sit down and have a cup of coffee. Those things are not learned by journalists today. They don't understand it.
Yeah, boy, there's a couple of things I want to talk about with that. And I guess when I went through my and we didn't call ourselves journalists, we were, TV, radio, broadcasting. We were mass communication. And these things are almost the same thing today, but back then there was a pretty significant difference. But we still learned about hard news, we still learned about soft news and these kind of things. But one of the things that was repeated, I went to school in the early 90s for these things, was that you weren't there to editorialize. Now you could write your story, and there maybe was a section where you could tell us what you think, but for the most part, your job was to answer the interrogatives and then get out of the way of the story, right? And so when you wrote, it maybe was a little harder on the news side, but when you're doing the TV thing, your job is to say what happened, who was there, these kind of things, and then keep the editorializing to the barest of minimums if you couldn't avoid it completely.
Right, right. And that's not what we're seeing today. We have such polarized media because the opinion of the commentator is what has become important, not the facets of the news. And
Yeah.
I attribute a lot of that to the fact that the institutional structure of journalism in this country has declined. There isn't the knowledge that used to be there, nor the intent to stick with things that are provable, to
Mm.
stick with information that's provable. I was watching the recent news coverage of the assassination attempt and noting it seemed as if the commentators were toning down some of their politically inspired rhetoric on both sides of the aisle. And I don't know if that's a subtle realization that some of the antagonism that was going on within the media toward both political or either political candidates or either party is being recognized as over the top or what's behind it. But it doesn't reflect when we're seeing commentators instead of reporters. It doesn't reflect well on people's ability to trust what they're hearing.
Yeah. That trust piece, right? I was having a conversation recently about the, almost the implied trust that we all had in someone like a Walter Cronkite
Right.
or just that era's newscaster. There wasn't a lot of, and maybe we were all fooled by this, and then there were very few outlets. But now, I'm going to say this: I watch David Muir sometimes, and I see him ramp up the hyperbole.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm like, why? Just do your job, shoot it straight, and don't stoke the fear about death when there's not even death happening yet.
Yeah.
And I lose respect for that. I lose trust with that.
Right. And I think there's a strong temptation in the midst of this media chaos that's going on now to identify things like lies or identify misinformation. But then it's difficult to do.
Right.
I've always objected to the idea of people calling people liars. Now, if there's a lie and you can show that it's a lie, you should refer to the lie. But the person that's saying that lie is lying at the moment. But describing them as a liar is a characterization. That's something other than reporting. And so you see a lot of that on both sides.
I want to be a little more specific about my critique of David Muir because I don't want to be unfair to him. But one of the times in the recent past when Texas was having a weather situation, he talked about the mobile morgue being called up for all of the bodies that were going to be there, right? And instead of saying, Texas has responded with its emergency management system that brings in a lot of resources to include a mobile morgue,
Right.
And then say, that these things, and then covering it and talking about it, he stoked up the body thing. And then ultimately ended up being there wasn't a need for a mobile morgue because there just wasn't that much death and destruction. People die in these things, but it was within a band of like the system could handle it. You still flex in the resource, right? But that's not what he reported on national news.
Right. It sensationalized the situation.
Right. And needlessly so. It was already sensational.
Well, we've had a history of sensationalism in the media, and I've written a book, it hasn't been published yet, about the Chicago mob and organized crime, and it focuses on the myth of Al Capone. Because, in history and everything we learn, Al Capone was the head of the Chicago mob. Well, he was never head of the Chicago mob. There was a guy named Jake Guzik, who is characterized in history as an accountant for Al Capone. But in actuality, Jake Guzik was the guy that was on the ground floor when the Chicago mob was organized. and he was a protector of Al Capone. But it was the media that made Al Capone the king of the Chicago mob and also made the Chicago mob Italian. The Chicago mob has always been multi-ethnic. It's been Jewish, it's been Italian, it's been Irish, it's you name it. There's
like Chicago.
Yeah, like Chicago. So people say, how do you know this? Well, I know it because I met a man a long time ago who happened to be Tony Accardo's midnight pinochle partner. And he was the liaison between Jimmy Hoffa and the Chicago mob. And he and I became well acquainted. And he introduced me to people, including Jake Guzik's son, Charlie, who was still alive. And I spent hours with him talking about his father and the way things were in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And it was fascinating stuff, and it was all documentable. So these are the myths that media reporting can create, whether they intend to or not, or whether it's sensationalized to draw attention. These are the kind of things that happen. Ask anybody in the world who ran the Chicago mob. It's Al Capone.
One of the jobs of the media is to hold account the rest of the government, right? You know, the fourth branch. And we've seen this all too often where the government wants to insert itself into court cases or their ego gets into the court cases. And so we'll see these things. And we're seeing it happen right now live where the cases are being dismissed and kicked out because there's not sharing equally from the DA side to the defense of documents. Right? And that's just against the rules. Like, hey, look, if you want to let Bill Cosby go free, well, then fucking around with people's rights. And that's what happens. This doesn't absolve Bill Cosby of what he did, but if the press isn't there to say, hey, you guys have had a problem with this in your office, you know, are we ever going to see this problem again, DA? And ask that hard question and know that hawk is going to be out there watching you and you're the DA.
Right.
Then, yeah, why not get away with these things for as long as you can to get the thing that gets you elected again or get you that popular conviction that you want to get?
Well, unfortunately, those kinds of things have been going on for a long time. And this documentary film that I mentioned is a case in point. There was these crimes occurred. There was a killing of a grandmother in her garage, and then a series of bombs went off a few weeks later in Speedway, Indiana, outside the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And then 4 kids were kidnapped from a fast food restaurant and found killed in the woods shortly thereafter, all within about 6 months. The only crime that the Justice Department said it solved was the bombing case. They arrested a guy named Brett Kimberlin, who was he was a marijuana smuggler at a very young age, but they prosecuted him for these bombs. He's maintained his innocence for some 40 years. He spent 20 years in prison. Part of his argument was that his case was tainted. Well, I tracked down a couple of years ago an ex-narcotics officer who was also a police hypnotist who hypnotized the witnesses in this bombing case and who testified. And he told me that Kimberlin indeed had ineffective assistance of counsel because Kimberlin's lawyer never discovered that this officer's cousin was on the jury.
Oh, no.
Was on the jury, and it was never disclosed to the judge. So very uncommon for me, because this case was laying dormant for so long. I gave an affidavit to Kimberlin's attorney telling them about that. The Justice Department followed up and got an affidavit from him too when they filed these things in court. He confirmed what he had told me. But then the Justice Department wouldn't move on anything pertaining to Kimberlin's case. They've stonewalled it from every direction.
Right.
So Kimberlin became kind of famous in the U.S. in the 80s when Dan Quayle was running for vice president, because Kimberlin told NPR radio that he sold pot to Dan Quayle back then. Quayle denied it. So, but the facts of this case have never been fairly adjudicated. And you see the Justice Department, not only didn't they share information they had, but they withheld information that was vital to a fair trial. So these things are still out there, and they happen all the time. We see all of these convictions overturned because of reasons just like this, the use of junk science in convicting people. It's a tragedy when people commit crimes and they get away with them, and it's a tragedy when the wrong person is convicted.
Yeah.
But we won't resolve these things.
And it's also a tragedy when the system is so desperate to convict a person who does the crime, cheats to get the conviction, and that person walks. I mean, I just like, and we see these kinds of things all the time. And I don't know. I mean, is the press not doing its job enough? I mean, some of this stuff's going to happen, right? I mean, the system is going to win a lot of these fights because it's the system. But do we want to hear from reporters who go out and say hard things to us about people that we think we love, politicians, judges, lawyers that are trying to fight the good fight to keep bad people off the streets?
I think it's essential that we hear these things, and the kind of reporting that used to exist, where those kinds of hard questions were asked, and the idea that you as a journalist were uh, supposed to bring these things to attention, and it was your responsibility to ask these hard questions. We've lost so much of that. Newspapers and TV and radio reporting were always flawed. They have always been flawed. There have always been sacred cows when newspapers were owned by local owners. I remember working on the wire desk and being told, don't put a story about an auto accident involving alcohol on this page because 3/4 of the page is for the local liquor store owner. So that story
Yeah.
had to go somewhere else. We still covered the news, but there were certain things protected. But in the corporate takeovers that occurred in the 80s when local ownership virtually disappeared and the large corporations took over, you saw some changes then, and those changes have just accelerated to the point where we are not even learning how to ask hard questions, let alone how to develop sources that allow us to ask those hard questions. You got to have some knowledge before you can ask the hard questions, and you got to have sources before you can have knowledge.
If you have any kind of a good memory for current events, you understand that we get lied to a lot.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I'm a common comment I'll say is, no, I'm told everything's okay. It's like, no, I'm told I'm fine. And I kind of go dead eyed. I'm told everything's okay. Right.
Right.
And because, I don't like to be lied to. And I don't care about party at all. I'm very nonpartisan. I don't have a party. I'll vote either side if I want to. I'll vote against the incumbent because I don't trust folks like that.
Yeah.
But I remember when Tulsi Gabbard eviscerated the candidacy of our current vice president, and then I see her become vice president, and I'm like, what happened?
Yeah.
I mean, that's these are the kind of things, and where's the reporters that go, how in the world are we doing this? And I didn't see that because I guess there's some kind of I'm left to guess, right? And if I'm left to guess, then I'm going to guess to the negative for the people that allow these things to happen.
Well, we shouldn't be guessing about anything. I mean, we should have enough information to make a
Yeah.
decision, and that's what I keep saying is that we need good journalism to have good democracy, and if
Sure.
you don't have good journalism, you're not going to have democracy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's
these openings are, yeah. I taught for a while in journalism school at Indiana University and at Metro State in Denver, and
yeah.
I found the same kind of interest among young journalists, the enthusiasm for stories, but they had no outlets to take their journalism,
Mm.
and so they would turn to public relations and those sorts of things. And I see even in my alma mater the very vigorous journalism program that they had at this small school is now pretty much oriented toward public relations because that's where the jobs are, and
Yeah.
they're not doing much with the kinds of reporting instruction that used to exist.
Let's get back into the Intel side because Intel, CIA, NSA, all these different organizations, they don't like to have their skirt lifted. And look, I'm an Intel guy. And if I was president, which will never happen, I'd be declassifying a lot of things, because the more transparency we have, the more we see what happens to our own selves, the more we realize what we're doing to other countries and how nefarious our intel folks, and I'm one of them, how we've acted towards other people and towards our own Americans. And gosh, they don't like that. They don't like to have their skirt lifted. They get really nasty about it. So they do a lot of things to protect themselves. And again, these things are really, I would say, illegal. But again, we need those reporters to help us understand these things.
Mhm. You know, when I started working on the Manchurian Journalist, I was yeah, exactly. I was interested. I'd been approached by, of all people, the Church of Scientology, as I was freelancing, and they asked me if I wouldn't look into the media coverage that the church had received and write a story for their magazine that they were relaunching, a magazine I discovered which actually had done some pretty good journalism back in the 70s, 80s, and some good work with FOIA and those kind of things. But I did that inquiry, and I found some legitimate concerns on their behalf about how the church had been covered by the media, and how, because I think a lot of it being the Hollywood tabloid media, a lot of jumping on of ideas and not real journalism going on. But I took a look at this book that was written about the Church of Scientology by Lawrence Wright, called Going Clear, as part of my later inquiries. And it was, well, there were problems with the book, and it was described as investigative, and I've been an investigative reporter most of my career. I found holes, but what I found about Lawrence Wright in looking at his background was even more interesting. And that was that he had participated in some programs that were created by what I've called the intelligence community, not just the CIA, but
Right.
various forms of the intelligence community, including powerful elites. That these programs were created to sort of salt the mine where journalism and publishing and cultural ideas were meeting, literary things, etc., to encourage Western values in connection to the Cold War. But these specific programs were designed to recruit people into journalistic positions and positions of influence. And Lawrence Wright participated in two of those, I discovered. And one was the Radcliffe Publishing Procedures course, which a lot of people might recognize because they publish every year the 100 top books that they recommend reading. But in essence, that course was a 6 weeks course in the summertime that recruited people into the publishing industry. And they sought out people's backgrounds, and they looked for people who were consistently in the right frame of mind and consistent with their frame of mind. And so those people went into publishing. They found jobs. They were helping pick what writers were promoted, what writers got the opportunities. They were doing things that were not directly related to the intelligence agency or the community, but were of interest and of value. And Wright's own history contains some fascinating stories that he's never mentioned. I followed his memoir that he wrote in 1984, where he discussed his effort to become a conscientious objector and his success at that during the Vietnam War. And he left out a lot of detail about how he got to where he got, and he falsified some of that material. And as I looked further, I discovered that his father worked for one of the most powerful intelligence-related individuals in the country. He was a man named Robert Story out of Dallas, who was head of the American Bar Association, dean of the SMU Law School, head of the International Bar Association, and the chief executive trial prosecutor at the Nuremberg war trials. But even though he owned the bank where Wright's father was president, and even though that bank hired a lot of ex-military officers for positions as loan officers when the bank didn't have enough business to support that many loan officers, none of that fascinating history has ever been mentioned by Lawrence Wright. And so that made me curious about his own role, because Wright went on to write and win the Pulitzer Prize for his book Looming Tower about Al Qaeda. And it raised questions in my mind where the stories were coming from that he was telling and where the perspective was coming from. I tried to ask him about these things, but he wouldn't talk to me about them. That's one thing I also found unusual because he's in the business of asking questions. He's a very famous reporter for the New Yorker magazine. He's published a lot and he's done a lot and very influential. These are kinds of questions I think it would be valuable for people to know. What is that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It gets my spine tingling when I think about these things and how often the pedigree of a given individual is very similar to the other pedigrees of the people who get picked for certain things.
Right.
And, there's a resume that the CIA likes. And, and I'm saying CIA. The intelligence community in certain areas, you're like, oh, of course, this person is of the right kind of upbringing and has the right kind of triggers and everything. And yeah, I'll be damned. There's nothing nefarious on the surface, but you can look and you can say, yeah, I understand why this person works in this field, how they got the opportunities, and why they write the way they do.
Yeah,
it's very clear when you see a lot of these things and you understand things. Let me back out a little bit and let's talk a little bit about investigative journalism. And I think we're going to be able to bring these two things together. So I'm working on some documentary stuff too, and I'm working with an investigative journalist. And again, like our paths, our worlds are very similar. And when we pick foreign policy 50 years back, 40 years back, 20 years back, whatever it is, we often sort of snap a chalk line and like, this side is good, this side is bad, because we want X to happen. The people on either side of the chalk line are like, what do you mean chalk line? What are you talking about? Well, I don't know. I'm not a bad person. I'm just doing my business. I'm over here doing this and this. I don't even care about America, Yeah. And then on the other side, we're like, oh, well, you're on the good side. And you look like the kind of person we want to support. And you make us feel good about ourselves. You speak English. You wear beautiful clothes. We like you. And we are bad at picking the right people. And so we'll turn someone who isn't evil, or at least isn't evil by the way we look at them. Maybe they're a sharp-elbowed business person, but we'll turn that person into a villain. And then we'll take the actual evil person who's going to turn coat on their own people. And boy, we'll make that person the hero until the second they actually show their true colors. We do this over and over and over. And it is a pattern. And here's what happens to the American and the Americans who pick these people and pick these policies. They change jobs. They go work for a think tank funded by foreign money. They get promoted and they get to continue to write papers about how great they did. And you look around and you're like, all that shit back there that you picked is burning. It's on fire. It's fucked up and people are dead.
Yeah.
Well, why aren't you responsible? And I'll be damned. There's not a lot of, and when you write something like that, people, they don't go to it. You don't win Pulitzer Prizes for writing that stuff.
No, you don't. But yet it's essential that these kinds of things be done. I started out as a police reporter, and I ended up not too long afterward as a columnist. And I was writing about common people out on the street, living their daily lives, trying to craft stories about what was really going on in the community. Not politics, not education, not police beat, but I kept gravitating toward things that required a little more investigation. And that's what eventually got me into investigative reporting, which was, the path I guess that I was headed toward all along, because digging into things, finding out where there were soft spots, troubled spots, things that needed attention, it led me to prison coverage. And I spent 10 years investigating human rights abuses and corruption inside state and federal prisons. And talk about an education in investigative reporting. I don't see. I did things a little differently than a lot of reporters. I was pretty passionate about the things I was writing about, and digging into these embarrassing things. I wrote some columns holding the governor of Indiana's feet to the fire for sexual abuse of women in a state women's prison. And the chief source that I had, who had become pregnant in prison and had a child of a guard, and she was punished by being put into solitary confinement in a very uncomfortable cell where women had to stand against a hot iron door with their feet showing out from underneath the door when they needed to use the restroom. Those kinds of cruelties, those kinds of things. We never, did the governor mean for those kinds of things to happen? I don't think so. But
Yeah.
when you're not paying attention and you're not listening to what's going on or investigating things, then you don't find out. It's the role of the newspaper. It was my role to report on those
Yeah.
things. And I did. I took a lot of heat for it, but that was part of the territory. I became used to that over the years. And I don't see anyone out there reporting on prison conditions and
Yeah.
things in the regular media now. And so look at what we have in our prison systems, a festering problem that
Yeah.
can be resolved.
I did a series that called the Prison Chronicles. I didn't even finish it because I couldn't get anybody to back it or to pick it up and to elevate it. And so I was basically dumping all of my time into something that I couldn't get. And it was good work. I mean, I had interviewed a bunch of people that had rehabilitated themselves either after 3 strikes, no idea if they were going to got out, or had committed murder and convicted. And it was solid work. And there were a couple of things I learned. Actually, I'm going to be speaking to some people who are incarcerated right now in a couple of hours. You're just kind of talking about the things that I've learned and seen. And one of the things that I understood was I could reach into the Department of Corrections, and I live in California, so I'm just going to talk about them. I could reach into the public affairs officials for the Department of Corrections, either at the prison level or the state level, and I could be ignored every single time I made a request. I see you shaking your head. That should never be the case, right? And then oftentimes when I talk, and this is not prison, if I reach out to a public affairs officer, they want a list of questions. And I'm like, well, I don't do a list of questions. I have a conversation about what the person knows about. Like, well, I have to have a list of questions. I'm like, well, I'm not going to give you a list of questions. That's not what's important. That person is an expert in this area, and we're going to have a conversation. You're welcome to listen to what we talk about, but your job is not to control what I do. Your job is to create the access, and I'm not trying to get you. But all these things happen, and that is not what public affairs people are for. This is how Pete thinks about the world. But when Department of Corrections at the public affairs level won't speak, won't respond, well, there's an indicator that there's a lot of problems. When I go and do my next level of jobs, and I go out and I talk to my people who are in the Department of Corrections at the ground level, and they're like, not a chance, Pete. I'm like, but you're retired. They're like, yeah, still not a chance. Now I know that there's a lot of dirt. There's a lot of bad things going on. And again, I'm left to guess. And so if I'm left to guess, I have to now point the finger and say, I can still do my show. And I'll say this. I tried to talk to Department of Corrections people, and they were terrified. They are cowards. They won't stand up when we know that there's problems. I have to say that. That's why I have to report. Now, I did talk to someone outside of the state, and she explained very clearly. She's like, I have got an 8-hour day the second I show up. And the second I show up, new stuff was put on my plate, and I'm in charge of people. I'm competing with Toyota, who opens a plant, and they pay better than we do. So I'm just looking for people that will do 8 and hit the gate. And that's the minimum standard. I cannot keep up with the pace of work. There's not enough. Now I can wrap my head around that, and I can ask questions on that. But that lady, in different state, different everything, and was retired, and I didn't identify her. That's what it took to get any information about corrections. And boy, it doesn't allow you to trust the system. And we're not even talking about the courts and what they do to put Americans behind bars, who don't treat people like they're innocent, who treat people like they need to be convicted to get on to the next thing.
Exactly.
Oh boy.
Well, I could tell you a series of stories about my experiences with prisons, but a couple of them stand out. After I had been bothering the Department of Correction for some time, I I insisted on going inside to take a look at the medical unit of a state reformatory. And they let me inside, and a couple of prison officials walked with me as I walked through, and I had conversations with inmates. And one of the inmates in the medical unit walked up and he handed me a little packet of papers. And I thanked him, and I took them and I put them in my notebook, and we went on through the prison. We came out to the outside, and the assistant warden said, I was getting ready to leave, he said, one of the inmates handed you some papers, and I need to have them back. And I said, well, sorry, he gave them to me, not to you, and I'm keeping them with me. And he said, well, I'm not going to let you out of here until you give them up. How's that? I said, okay, let's go upstairs and get on the phone with the deputy commissioner of corrections, and let's see how that goes. So he called the deputy commissioner. He handed me the phone. I said, look, his name is Cloyd Schuler. I said, look, Cloyd, your picture and my picture above the fold tomorrow morning if I'm not outside this prison in 5 minutes. He swore a little bit, handed the phone back to the assistant warden, and I was outside. And that was the kind of relationship that existed. There were efforts to intimidate all the time. Later on, the head of security at that same institution let me in while there was a riot going on in the prison. And I actually crawled through a cell house full of smoke from tier to tier, talking to inmates about what was going on. And later on, when they came up off lockdown on the cell house, and they allowed inmates to go into the recreation area, the head of security let me go into the recreation area by myself. And I walked in, sat on the bleachers with some inmates, and they wanted to know who the hell I was. I said, I'm a reporter from the Indianapolis Star. I said, how many of you guys are armed? They all lifted up their shirts and showed me their shivs. It was that kind of experience and reporting on that kind of thing firsthand that really gave me the access to sources within the prison. So a couple of years later, I got a call from the Department of Correction one afternoon, and they said that inmates on death row had taken 3 guards hostage, and they were holding them, threatening to kill them, and they wanted to talk to me, and they wanted me to conduct the negotiations. So much to the department's dismay, I wound up spending the night talking with these inmates about releasing hostages and about the conditions of confinement on death row that were pretty brutal. And the part I remember most about that story or that event is that when we finally got the hostages released and the inmates all put back in their cells with no beating, I still had 15 minutes before the last deadline of the paper, and I got to a phone, picked up the phone, and called in my story, and it bannered the paper the next morning. It was, those kinds of things, that kind of journalism, I don't see happening much anymore. But I wouldn't have been in that position if I hadn't been writing about these conditions and trying to bring these to public attention. Even though a city editor, when I first started on prison stories, told me, well, why bother? These people are in prison because they belong there. Who cares? Yeah.
It's I'm a big believer in, because of what we do. I'm a big believer in the ground truth. And when you can deliver ground truth to someone who's trying to be in charge of a system and trying to run it well, and they crave it. They don't get enough. And so I've been in a conversation. I've been out in this remote part of Afghanistan. And we're trying to make these decisions far removed from that, maybe 35 miles, but 1 million miles as far away as operationally.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the State Department guys, he's not out to get me, but he's also out to get me. And he's like, hey, Pete, in that area that you're in, what's the #1 TV show they watch there? Right. And I go, oh, and his name is Dennis. Like, oh, Dennis, there's no electricity there. And he's like, oh. So he shot an arrow at me. It's fine. That's part of the game.
Right.
And not only did I catch it, I fucking rocketed it right back at him and threw it next to his head. So we understand, like, you don't come at me like that. 2, you don't know what the fuck is going on, And if we're going to make decisions about these people, you damn well better have them in this room with us. I would say it all the time. Like, Dave, let's evaluate the Afghan government. I'm like, raise my hand. And I always, I'm a wise ass, but I do it for a reason. Like, is this the kind of meeting that we talk openly and honestly, like, and ask questions, or are we just gonna just nod and say yes? No, Pete. Of course, we're gonna be honest and open. Of course, we're trying to fix things. Where are the Afghans? Oh, this meeting's classified. Can we just unclassify it? Because the Afghans need to be here to talk about what's going on in their government. And everybody's like, fuck, God damn it. Okay. And so the ground truth matters, right? In all of these things. And so if we're going to rehabilitate people, great. If we're going to punish people, great. But let's understand what that looks like. Because sometimes punishment and being cruel and evil are not the same thing. And sometimes rehabilitation, I mean, you shine a light on it and you're like, that's what rehabilitation looks like here. And the boss is like, that's not what I want people doing. That's not what you guys said you were going to do. Where are the results? And you go look at the back end of the machine and you're like, hey, here's the results of your rehabilitation. These people are scared, they're hiding, and they're scrambling, trying to not commit crimes, but they're living under bridges.
Yeah.
And the boss is like, that is not what you guys are briefing me on. We have to fix this, right? And so if you don't have people that have courage to say, hey, all these guys in this staff room that said they're delivering something to you, great. I just went out and looked at the end product and it's fucked up. So what are we going to do about that? Not my job to figure out what to fix, but it is my job to report back to you that what you said was going to happen is not reliably happening. If you got a different answer, let's go look at it together, but I don't see it.
Yeah, exactly. When I was doing the Manchurian Journalist, there was a certain level of discomfort there because when you look at journalism as a journalist and you turn around and look at the flaws directly and look at the influences directly, it's distressing. It's there are a ton of journalists I've met in my life that I really respect and consider good people and honest and probably know less than I knew about these kinds of circumstances, influences on journalism than I did when I started this in these inquiries. It's you sometimes you just have to stand up and say, there's a turd in the punch bowl, as the FBI used to say to me.
Yeah.
And that's exactly right. There's something you have to mention.
We're talking to Dan, and he's got this fantastic book, The Manchurian Journalist. The link is down below. You guys know what I always say: buy two and buddy read this thing, and you learn a little bit more about the corruption of the American journalist. It's right here in the marquee. You guys can't probably see that on there, but the reason why we're talking about these issues and problems is as we look at our news and how tainted and slanted it can be. There are people out there doing good work. I mean, they just go private. They go solo. Like a guy like Matt Taibbi doesn't need ABC to hire him. He can just go and write his own news. Glenn Greenwald does the same thing. There's a lot of people out there doing this stuff, but we have to go out and find these non-traditional formats. So there are places for this. Documentaries are becoming a very powerful place to tell these stories. What makes you hope? Well, we talked about a lot of hard, nasty, gross stuff. Let's talk a little bit about some of the good things that you see out there, because there are people out there doing incredible work.
There are. And I look at reporters on the national news who are people like Richard Engel, who are on the ground in difficult situations, and I admire the work that they do and the courage they show to be out there. There's a lot of people doing that. While newspapers are gone, I don't think the spirit of journalism has disappeared. I don't think the passion that people feel for telling the truth. It's as you say, the platforms or the opportunities to do it. Where do you find them? That's when I was writing the Manchurian Journalist and looking for a publisher. I had trouble finding a publisher because of the nature of the book and what it said. It's a closed world in some ways, and so finding a way, whether it's through film, documentaries, and I do think that's a great opportunity for journalism to move into. People are very visual, and I think there are great ways to tell stories. This documentary we're working with an animator out of Austin, Texas, who's won a couple of Emmys for for their realistic animation, and we're using that to tell the backstory of this very complicated series of crimes in 1978, all those years ago. But it gives us a vehicle through which we can reach people. We used to be able to reach people through newspapers, I think, fairly effectively because most people read newspapers. They were on the front page. I delivered newspapers when I was 11 years old.
Same.
I did. I had the paper run and 2 bicycles to do it with, and it's I think that almost every house in my neighborhood was on my route list. But you stop and think about how many people are subscribing to newspapers now. They're getting most of their news not locally but nationally, and the local news has slipped. You don't see. I was just discussing this the other day with someone about the fact that newspapers used to publish every day a list of marriages and divorces that were filed. They published a list of bankruptcy cases that were filed and cases in criminal court. They published arrests and those sorts of things in agate type. And it was a lot of work, but it kept a record of the community, that living history that allows me as an investigative reporter to go back into the Dallas Morning News from 40 years ago and double check on a story that's told by Lawrence Wright from when he was growing up as to its accuracy. Those kinds of, that chronicle of history, that local history is being lost to us. So, documentary films may be able to restore some things, and maybe outlets for reporting that do so. The internet offers us a lot of opportunities for reporting, discussing things, and also a lot of opportunities for misinformation, which is part of the big problem. But
I wanted to bring this up because I wanted to get your thoughts on it. The record, and I want to say that newspapers are a perfect record of the record, but you can triangulate pretty well there, and you can look at different papers if you happen to know for a region, like the Trib versus the Sun Times, right? And you can bounce back and forth and decide what you want to read, get an idea. But the old newspapers are very hard to change. They're there.
That's right.
Now with links, and you're like, has this been modified? The news is malleable. What happened, what was said is changeable. But I can, because I've got a newspapers.com subscription. I'm in there today. I'm in there all the time looking at what was said at the time. What were the editorial things that were done? And I love reading that. And also, by the way, the tenor of the news. The news has always had its yellow times, and there's always that stuff, but it wasn't murder, and horrible and Nazis and Adolf Hitler all the time.
Right.
It was a variety of things. There was even, get this, on the front page, there was even some good news every now and then. And so we don't have that record that's fairly firm.
Yeah.
That, look, it's going to get the tint that it's not perfect, but it is there, and you can fairly well rely that no one's gone back and edited the words in the last 100 years.
Exactly. And we don't have any assurance that that's the case because
we do not.
Everything is changeable, and it becomes impermanent in a way. Where will it be saved? The newspaper morgues used to be wonderful places where you could find all of the background that you wanted to find. Those morgues those newspaper morgues are gone. They're not keeping that kind of record anymore, and that's a shame.
Yeah. And not every paper is in one spot. You could reliably go to a library and get a lot of things. It would take a lot of time to microfiche or microfilm and get through these things. And some of it's, in different sources. But I do worry about our ability to get reliable access to things. And even look, as our books become electronic, hey, where'd that book go?
Yeah.
What are you going to do about that? Oh, this book's been edited. I didn't even know. Oh, wow. And that becomes a problem.
It very well could happen under this current system. So we're in a brave new world, that's for sure. And it's sometimes difficult to navigate, to find what's true.
Yeah. So I don't want to take any more of your time. This has been great, and I'm enjoying reading through the book, and I'm not through all of it yet, but this kind of stuff just fascinates me to begin because of my background and everything, and the amount of information operation that goes into all of this stuff, and how much it permeates into our day to day life. You see, and we see it with this assassination attempt on Donald Trump. There's people that like it's not true, it didn't happen, this is what happened, and they got picture evidence, and everybody becomes a sleuth of some kind, and I'm just like, wow, oh my god, this person almost died, and we're already done with that, moving on to the next thing.
Isn't it interesting?
It blows my mind
how that can happen.
Yeah, who would be the Walter Cronkite today? Like, who is the one person you could think of if they sat down in front of us in some form or fashion, be it Instagram, ABC News, whatever it is? Who is that person?
That's a really interesting question, because I can't immediately come up with an answer.
Yeah.
I think I think back to when Walter Cronkite finally spoke out on the news about the Vietnam War, and what a shock that was to everyone that he had rendered an opinion about something, because he had delivered the news to us in a fashion that we absolutely trusted. I remember watching, the events of the Kennedy assassination unfold on television when I was a sophomore in high school. And what you believed, what you relied on was the reporting from people like Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather and those people.
Yeah.
You believed it, you trusted, you didn't question it. But I don't
Yeah.
know who you would put in that chair today.
Yeah. Yeah. And like the first name I can come up with is Mr. Beast, but that's not his job. And he's a guy on YouTube who does all these, videos that are really aligned towards kids, and he can get every video 100+ million people to watch it. And that's amazing. Like, he's bigger than the Super Bowl every time he puts a video up. It's
Wow.
like it's huge. And so if he was to take off his glasses and say the president has been shot, I don't know what people would do, lose their minds, because that's not what he does. He's this high energy guy. It's a whole new world, and I don't know. Anyhow, it's crazy. Any questions for me before we wrap this thing up? And seriously, thank you very much. It's been a great conversation.
Well, I've really enjoyed it. I think there's been some very interesting issues that we've discussed, and I've appreciated your perspectives on coming from your experience in life and how that works. Great stuff.
Yeah, well, like I said, I'm sort of a failed reporter, and I wanted to do a lot of these kind of things too. I wanted to do sports, but I have covered prisons. I am covering some foreign policy things because these things do matter to me. And if no one else is going to do it, then all right, I'll try to make a ruckus if they'll let me. But in the meantime, everybody should buy the Manchurian Journalist right here. There's the link right down below. It's in the remarks. It's in the comments for the show. And get Dan's book, and you're going to dig it. And then whenever he comes out with his documentary, whenever you come out with the new book, let's continue to talk about these things, because I want to support people that know the ground truth and put it out there so that we can all deal with it, because I don't like being lied to. And I like folks to go out there and say, this is what actually is happening with these things. And that way we have half a chance of knowing what the truth looks like.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity for the conversation. It's been interesting.
All right. Hang on one sec. I'll be right back to you.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.